Hello and welcome to Orthodox Communities and American Politics. My name is Talia Graff and I'll be helping to facilitate this session behind the scenes. This learning session is part of a 2-week symposium entitled Judaism, Citizenship, and Democracy from the Sholom Hartman Institute. I would like to acknowledge our partners in this evening's program: the Jewish Center, Stanton Street Shul, Ramath Orah, Westside Institutional Synagogue, the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, Hudson Yard Synagogue, the Prospect Heights Shul, the Downtown Minyan, Kehilath Jeshurun, and the Riverdale Minyan. And now we are ready to begin our learning. I'll hand it over to Dr. Elana Stein Hain.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's great to be with you. I'm scrolling through some of the names of the attendees and just imagine that we were in the same room together. I'm smiling at you the way I'm smiling at the camera. Thanks for being with us. I'm about to be joined by Avi Helfand and Rivka Schwartz. And Avi and Rivka, I would ask you to come onto the video. And our topic tonight, before I introduce our panelists, our topic tonight is part of a project that we've been doing at the Sholom Hartman Institute of North America for the last few years, called Jewish Values and American Democracy. We've been discussing how it is that American Jews have created such different narratives about what Jewishness is about and about what Americanness is about, and how sometimes those narratives actually are tailored to each other. So you can judge a person's idea of what America can be based on their religious affect, and you can judge a person's view of religion based on what they think America should become. So this conversation is a conversation that Avi, Rivka, and I, with several other colleagues, have been having for a very long time now, and it's wonderful to be able to share it with you. What's incredible about the audience tonight is that we have people for whom a conversation about Orthodox community and politics is actually what they experience on a day-to-day life. They are members of Orthodox communities and Orthodox shuls, like the three of us, and we have people who are on this video interested in learning from what we have to say as somebody who is not part of the Orthodox community. And I just want to name that diversity because I think it's rather remarkable, and it's just great to have every one of you here. So let me tell you who our panelists are tonight. Michael Avi Helfand is a senior fellow at the Kogod Research Center at the Sholom Hartman Institute of North America. And when he's not doing that, and even when he is doing that, he's an expert on religious law and religious liberty. He's currently a professor of law and associate dean for faculty and research at Pepperdine University School of Law. Avi received his JD from Yale Law School and his PhD in political science from Yale University. He's a frequent author and lecturer, and his work considers how the state treats religious law, custom, and practice. You may have seen Avi's articles in the Yale Law Journal, but probably more likely, you may have seen him writing in the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, The Forward. His voice is really critical on matters of religion and state in America. In addition to his academic work, Avi is an executive board member of the Beth of America, where he also serves as a consultant on the enforceability of rabbinical arbitration agreements and awards in U.S. courts. Avi, thanks for being with us tonight, or for you this late afternoon.
Pleasure.
Dr. Rivka Schwartz, we're happy to have you with us as well. Rivka Schwartz is a fellow at the Kogod Research Center at the Sholom Hartman Institute of North America. And when she's not doing that, and even when she is doing that, she has spent more than 15 years in the field of Jewish secondary and post-secondary education. Rivka currently serves as the Associate Principal of General Studies at the SIR High School in the Bronx in New York. She earned her PhD in the history of science from Princeton University, writing her dissertation about the cultural history of the Manhattan Project. Rivka lectures widely on issues of contemporary importance in the Orthodox community. And if you want to know about the pulse of the beating heart of Orthodoxy, Rivka is the person you want to speak to. She lives in Washington Heights in New York with her family. So Rivka and Avi, let's get to it. And for the people out there who are sending us questions, send them the whole time, no problem. We're just going to get to them about 20 minutes from the end so that we can let this conversation breathe a little bit. I just want to start with polarization that can be felt very deeply in Orthodox communities. I know people are throwing around numbers 70-30, 80-20, 40-60. I don't really care about the percentages right now in terms of the split on who's voting for whom in the upcoming election. What I care about is that there clearly is a feeling of polarization in the air around Orthodox Shabbos tables, in shul, in school. And I want to talk about that with you. So I'm going to start with you, Avi. How do you experience the polarization in Orthodoxy right now around the upcoming election and politics in general? And what to you is the most salient dimension of the dispute happening within that community and within those communities?
Well, I suspect we all feel it, but certainly speaking for myself, feel it when conversations, normal conversations, they begin to veer towards something political, and you can see almost people like feeling out the people they're speaking with, like the cadence slows down as somebody's not sure if they're going to say the next word in the sentence, in a way in which and they're looking around, like trying to gauge what their reaction is going to be, which is unfortunate because I kind of think of debate and conversation within at least my Jewish community, every Jewish community I've been a part of, is one of my favorite things. Shabbos table and around food, after davening, really trying to get at things that are important and central to who we are as a people. And so, the way in which it slows down conversation, makes people leery of what they're going to say, is something that certainly bothers me. And when I try to think about kind of why are people nervous about what they're going to say, to my mind, I feel like different sides of the political ledger have co-opted certain kinds of language that make it very difficult for them to have a conversation on a level playing field. So, and now we're going to engage in crass generalizations. Now, on the one hand, you have people, when a conversation between your prototypical person on the left and your prototypical person on the right, when they clash, the person on the left will say, to the person on the right, what about Jewish values? And the person on the right will say to the person on the left, what about Jews? Almost as if to be on the right means you care about Jews, to be on the left means you care about Jewish values. And obviously both things are true and false, and in interesting ways. But to me, the way conversations, at least I personally experience them, it's almost as if, because we're dealing with incommensurable goods, like we can't even talk. So I like Jews and you like Jewish values, and therefore we're just in different parts of the world. And there's nothing for us to share with each other except to argue that you are thinking about the world incorrectly. And, the reality is, of course, we're trying to pull at different strands of Jewish values and trying to paint a picture of them in terms of what our commitments look like. But until we kind of are able to agree that we're all talking about different kinds of Jewish values, I think it's very hard to have genuine and thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you phrase it as Jews and Jewish values. I often think about Jewish interests versus Jewish values. And I think it's actually, there is a group of people who talk about this as interests versus interests, and not necessarily only values. And it's funny to say only, right? Not necessarily values versus values, but the point that you're making, essentially, that people are just, their wires are crossing in ways that don't allow them to talk. Rivka, what about you?
I come at this conversation from the experience of being in the one institution, the big modern Orthodox high school, where I actually think we're trying to hold the whole community in one place. I used to say if the only institutions, there's a lot of discussion, let me back up for a second. There's a lot of discussion among political scientists and sociologists about the increasing, not just polarization of American politics, but sorting of American life. So that Americans are much more likely now to choose to live among other people who essentially share their politics, to separate out, and therefore to live in communities in which they are, as much as they can, interacting with people who are like them, who share their perspectives, their points of views. This can be overstated. I think it's important to say that. I think it's important to say that for all the polarization, I like to share with my students the statistic that there are more Republican voters, there are more Trump voters in Los Angeles County than in the entire state of Wyoming. So Wyoming's a red state, and of course, California is a very blue state, but just by virtue of numbers and population, even a smaller percentage of a much larger population. So you could overstate how sorted and how polarized we are. But having said that and holding that in mind, we have tended to become much more polarized and much more sorted. And in a community that's defined by its religious parameters, we are together with people with whom we are very different from in terms of politics. And so we are experiencing that strain of trying to figure out how to be in community with people whose politics are very different than ours, where in other places in America, they're just sorting out. And so they're not experiencing that strain because they're separating. So I used to say it's the big community shuls and the big high schools, and that's where we're trying to live together, and it's challenging.
Well, also the family WhatsApp groups. Don't forget the family WhatsApp groups, because anybody here in the Orthodox community who has a family WhatsApp group knows that they're trying to hold that as well, but please. But the schools and the shuls, yes.
I'm fortunate to be spared that. But then it was actually a former student of mine who pointed out to me that in any of our big suburban Jewish communities or our big urban Jewish communities, the shuls are sorting by politics as well. And people know this is the conservative shul and this is the liberal shul. And so, in fact, really the one institution in modern Orthodox life, I think, that's trying to hold us all together in one place are these, or, you know, hold all these parts of the community are these schools. And we do find what Avi described, that kind of feeling out. It's remarkable to me that people on the right experience themselves as being under the, you know, the censorious eye of the left, and people on the left experience themselves as being under the censorious eye of the right. And everybody feels like they're not free to speak because someone's going to jump down their throat. So right now we are physically proximate, and we are together in institutions because we are joined by our religious commitments and for other reasons, but there's not a sense in which there's meaningful engagement around this political difference happening or meaningful conversation. In fact, people often feel like they can't talk or it's not safe to talk. And I'll say one more thing about that maybe, which is something that we see a great deal of, is for whatever the reasons Avi laid out, I affiliate more with this party or that party. I think this party or that party is closer to my understanding of what's good for Judaism or what's good for the Jews. So far, so good. But then what happens is you get the need to bring everything perfectly and 100% into alignment. So now I have to pretend that every part of this particular permutation of the American political alignment is 100% lined up with God, Torah, Judaism, what's good for the Jews, and that other political party or position is 100% terrible for God, Torah, Judaism, and the Jews. And it obliterates a more nuanced conversation that says there are things I agree with on both sides and things I agree with on neither side. And in the totality of things, here is where I feel like my values impel me to land, and you might feel like your values impel you to land somewhere else. Instead, we get red team, blue team, tribalism in a way that extinguishes the possibility of meaningful conversation.
Right. So if Avi is giving us Jews and Jewish values, what you're giving us is this is actually narrowing and trying to shape what Torah and Judaism means on the basis of a red version or a blue version, and it's narrowing it in significant ways. Am I getting that right?
So, yeah, or I use the term Torah watching. You know, I launder my political positions through Torah so that now the entire Democratic platform or the entire Republican platform is somehow inscribed in the 5 books of Moses, except it's not.
Yeah, yeah. It's on the one hand, people actually want to bring their Jewish values into the conversation, but on the other hand, using the trump card of, well, this is the line, this is the verse, this is the law that I'm going to cite, and I'm ignoring the other side of the conversation, is actually a slightly manipulative move, even if it has personal meaning, right? Meaning there's something in between manipulating and pretending that's the only perspective and saying, well, this is the perspective that I actually want to emphasize, right? Meaning that those are choices that we make all the time, emphasizing. But let's actually jump in and get a little deeper into what this conflict is all about. I want to start with just American Orthodox identity. And American Orthodox Jews are not one thing, even within their different versions, even within the ultra-Orthodox community, even within the modern Orthodox community. Not one thing. And yet you can find in some of the deliberations in the 20th century, from figures like Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Soloveitchik, from Haredi figures, from ultra-Orthodox figures, you can find conversations that are really trying to figure out, are Jews in America guests, fundamentally? And should we think of ourselves as guests, which would work in with a theology of diaspora and exile? Are Jews in America hosts, right? Are we members who have civic duties and we want to get involved? Are we even hosts and think of ourselves as having a certain amount of power and strength, and therefore we can help others? And I'm wondering, from the two of you, and Rivka, I'm going to start with you, how do you see these questions of guests and membership and hosts and civic duty? How do you see this playing out in Orthodox communities that you're a part of? Not asking you to talk about anything that you're not a part of, but Orthodox community that you're a part of. How does this play out in the relationships of Orthodox communities to American institutions, to government, to broad visions of what America should be? How does this guest host membership piece play out, in your opinion?
I don't see, and I would love to have somebody tell me where I'm missing it and where they see it, but in a lot of engagement in the Orthodox community and its discussions of politics, I don't see a lot of discussion of what can we do to better or improve American society. What does this country need to be healthier? In whatever direction you think that is, that the country needs to have a healthier body politic or a healthier culture or take better care of its people or whatever else you think it needs to do, and what can we as American Orthodox Jews do to help make that happen? I hear much more discussion, almost exclusively I hear discussion about what do we need from the government, from the system, from the society? How can we ensure that our needs are met and our interests are protected? And that can come from a number of different places. That can come from feeling like a beleaguered minority and the only thing we can do is try to protect ourselves, which I don't, we are a minority and certainly sometimes we are beleaguered. But as Elana pointed out, we are also, we have achieved a great deal of success in this country. We wield influence and in certain ways power. But it's also a question of how we think about ourselves, and I don't see that same kind of discourse, which interestingly one does find in certain precincts of the Christian right. What do we need to do? Go reshape this country in a more godly sort of way. And I don't really experience a lot of that happening in the Orthodox world. How can we make America better for whatever value of the term better you choose to adopt? Instead, I hear vastly much more conversation about what are our community's needs in the United States, in Israel, which candidate is going to be better at providing for them, securing them, ensuring that we continue to have the ear of politicians and our needs are met. And for me personally, this is not, I'm not going to make a religious argument now for whether Jews should view themselves as, as guests or as residents or as citizens or whatever other noun you'd like to use. For me personally, I feel deeply invested in the American project, in the American undertaking. I'm not sure, I could try to come up with origin stories as to why that is, but the bottom line is that I do. And I want my students to want to help make this country better, or whatever given value, of the term better you want to use. And I do want to see a community that thinks and cares and invests more in advancing a more perfect union, not just in securing its own needs or even in protecting its own rights, which is different than securing its own needs and is also important, but it's not the only thing I want our community to be thinking about or talking about.
So in a way, what you're offering is don't think about it as guests or hosts. Think about it as rights and obligations, or entitlements and duties. And what you're asking is, how much are we focused on our own rights and needs? As you say, they may be two different things. And how much are we focused on the larger project or our obligation to the larger project? Is that a fair?
Or maybe it's more actor and acted upon. To the extent that we don't see ourselves as having agency in this society, to the extent that we are just acted upon, then we want to make sure that the actors who are acting on us are doing it in the most helpful and least harmful kind of way. And once we realize that we have agency in this society, we are not just being acted on by a government, but we in fact, like every other American citizen, but probably more than some, given the position we hold, the education levels we have, the economic success that we have, there are various reasons why we might be better placed to help shape American society than some other groups, and to think about as agents in the society, as people who are capable of acting, what kinds of actions should we be taking and to what ends?
Yeah, so this is a great time to lob it over to Avi, because Avi, you're so involved in Jewish amicus briefs, meaning where actually Jews are trying to shape a certain way that America is going to be in certain instances. It would be great to hear your take on this.
So as Rivka knows, I got a slightly different view on this one, which is why it's fun hanging out with Rivka. So I really like, first of all, I like the categories, because I think, when we think about Orthodox Judaism in the United States, we're pretty young, and our advocacy is pretty young. Like you think of other denominations, Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, I mean, they've had advocacy in the United States much longer. It's certainly institutionalized. And, institutionalized Orthodox advocacy is like, I don't know, 60 years. It's not that old. It's pretty fledgling. And I think in the beginning, much of it really did, track this notion that we're guests here and trying to make a space, and which certainly tracks, theological ideas of galut and things along those lines. I mean, it was a very natural fit. And I certainly think it's also true, maybe even obviously the case, that Orthodoxy has grown in strength and influence, even as some of our language that we retain in terms of galut, or maybe more accurately galus. I think we have started to see ourselves as hosts, and I'm pretty I think the best way to say this, I fundamentally disagree with Rivka that you don't see Orthodoxy trying to reshape the United States in a way to make it better on metrics that it thinks are better. And by that I mean, I view these things, as you said, Elana, through the prism of church-state debates, which invariably touch on either attempts to protect religion in the form of religious liberty or separation of church and state. Should religion be in the public square, and politics, and how should that sort itself out? And increasingly, the number of Orthodox Jewish organizations and institutions, they've proliferated, that advocate in this space. First of all, in areas that are unrelated to Jewish interests, but advocacy about transforming the religious character of the United States. Things like, the best example I can think of is like religious displays on government property, religious prayer in legislatures. Things that I suspect we all have very different views on. To be candid, I'm somewhat ambivalent about all those things. But those things aren't quite interests. Whether or not you have religious displays on government property or you have prayers in a legislature, you're not getting resources out of that. Nobody's paying for their day school tuition because maybe they are, because somebody prayed in a legislature, or because you had a creche in a courthouse. I think those things are about Orthodoxy wanting to have the United States reflect increasingly a religious character, because it wants to see itself in its institutions. And that's about changing the way America looks and feels in a way that's consistent with, I think, Orthodoxy's deep commitment to, a religious experience in all facets of life. So you have a question.
Do you think it's fair to say, Avi and Rivka, that maybe in the particular consciousness of individual Orthodox Jews in communities, you don't necessarily see that same feeling of what we're doing to shape America, and yet there are places like, oh, here's one. And yet there are places where actually, like in the realm of advocacy, that if people had actually their eye on what was going on there, they would see that kind of investment all the time. Meaning it's possible that it's just a split screen.
So, the kind of corollary to what I just said, I think is sometimes we're not talking about percentages, but sometimes the fact that Orthodoxy increasingly leans right politically, I think is in part an intuition among your average Orthodox citizen that they want to see a certain kind of value system reflected in their representatives and in their party, and they find that more in the Republican Party. If Orthodoxy really does view its values as deeply invested in religious commitment and theology, etc. So the fact that, if you really buy into this idea that we increasingly see ourselves as hosts, even as the language you use so frequently is in the frame of gullus, but still that we want to see those in our elected representatives and our national institutions, it's not surprising that you see a veering of, Orthodox demographics towards a party where they see those values.
Right, meaning essentially what you might be talking about is simply how do progressive values line up with orthodoxy versus how do conservative values line up with orthodoxy. Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to push a little bit more on relationship to government, because I would imagine that there are some people who are wondering about some of the skepticism about government or some of the suspicion about government that we're seeing right now in Hasidic communities regarding crackdowns on coronavirus. And I mean, I'm in New York, and there's a lot of talk about Cuomo and de Blasio and people being concerned that Jews are being singled out for their coronavirus violations, and that maybe there's a little bit of stoking of Jew hatred going on there. So I'm wondering if either of you want to comment on that, because I'm sure it's on the minds of some people, and it certainly does relate to this question of how do Jews see themselves and how do Orthodox Jews see themselves vis-a-vis the larger institutions of America.
So Avi and I have been having these conversations for a while, and so I will not surprise him at all when I say that I often, when these kinds of things happen, I'm interested in trying to understand them as situated in broader American developments that are going on, rather than particularistic Orthodox community developments. So for example, breakdown of trust in institutions and the breakdown of trust in government, this is a broad phenomenon. Gallup polling has measured across the United States, across institutions in the past few decades. It actually came up in a history class that I was teaching today. I was teaching about the election, and we were talking about counting mail-in ballots, and a 10th grade student of mine said, why would anyone trust that people opening paper ballots and envelopes are doing that like in a dispassionate, unbiased way and feeding all the ballots in, as opposed to shredding the ballots of the one they didn't agree with. And I said, that's so indicative of a place at a time we are in the United States. There's so little trust in institutions and in government. So you can, of course, point to Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn and their lack of ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, and their lack of trust in Cuomo or de Blasio, which may or may not be earned, and Avi can speak to that better than I can. But I certainly remember the Shabbos table discourse when Barack Obama was president, and it was not infused with deep trust of institutions and government, and that was not in the Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox world. So I don't think this is a phenomenon particular to that part of the community. Again, I think that the decline in trust is intense and is there. It definitely comes along with the partisan polarization, although there are other factors as well. And I think that understanding that and thinking about how you address it this is one particular manifestation of it, but obviously the anti-mask protests in the nation more broadly and the Liberate Michigan and Liberate Virginia, this is not a phenomenon that's unique to the Orthodox community.
Maybe I'll just take the baton from Rivka and just say yes and, as opposed to my previous no but. One of the things that's happened as a result of the pandemic, I mean, first of all, we as a society, as a world, are under stress like we've never experienced before. And people are in need of resources, all different kinds of resources. I mean, I'm talking about psychological resources, financial resources, everything that you could possibly need in the midst of, for most families, some of the most challenging thing they may ever experience in their lives. And so, all you're doing at that point is you're making various kinds of resources incredibly scarce, and people, frightened and concerned, wondering what's going to happen next. And when you put into that environment, government, which now needs to play the role of regulator, when people are desperately grasping for the things they need in order to survive, I mean, it's going to be tough. Even on the best of days, it's going to be tough. When you add to that the following, I think, core insight of the entire pandemic, which is government in regulating around the pandemic has had to engage not only in risk analysis, but in benefit analysis, meaning it's not like government could say when this, when trying to figure out its way around all this, we're going to treat all activity the same way or differently based on how risky it is. Because the bottom line is groceries got to stay open. I mean, no matter how, even if, other analogous activities, are just as risky, the grocery is going to stay open and some things aren't going to stay open. And when you start kind of, from there, realizing that government was going to have to regulate by category, by industry, that some industries in this game of regulation were going to win and some were going to lose. In the midst of, kind of the horror of the pandemic, you have put together like all the components of the very worst in people. And so what you had ultimately around the country were like, the worst of it was, on the financial side, the way in which certain industries were able to elbow their way in, and in order to generate better economy.
So your yes and isn't really saying that there's anything particularly Orthodox about this. This is not a situation in which Orthodox Jews don't think that the government has their interest at heart. This is simply, it's an American phenomenon, and it happened to come down to some religious institutions having to close. Or do you want to say something more pointed than that?
Yeah, I'm going to go a little more pointed.
That's what I thought. That's where I'm pushing you.
Yeah. So, so it's no good. Straight off the bat, it's no good. The worst of it was a case that went up to the Supreme Court where you're in Nevada, and Nevada's got no, people aren't allowed to open unless you're a casino. And God knows people spend a lot of time in casinos, and there are a lot of folks there. And, when you see that, it undermines trust in government, because it makes you feel like, wait a minute, that's not based on risk. That's based on something else. That's because casinos in Nevada are winners, and that has to work. And I don't want to belittle it. Obviously, the economy and people need to get jobs and make money. And as a result, I can see why you might open up an industry like that. But it really eats away at trust. And then when you introduce into this kind of environment where you have different kind of ways of regulating houses of worship, in the midst of an environment where kind of money seems to talk, but worship doesn't seem to talk quite as much in certain jurisdictions, what you're begging for is people not to trust government. And then when you add into that, I would say even more complicated for the Orthodox community, and you've seen the reactions to this, the protests around the country in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and those protests going on, and houses of worship not, and all the litigation that came around that, and Mayor de Blasio saying that's because the protests are more important than houses of worship. So then what you have is just a complete toxic alignment.
So the distrust is earned. In a way, the distrust is earned, not only among Orthodox Jews, but there is something to be said for some repair that should happen between government and some of those communities.
So would
that be a fair?
So I don't want to quite say that. I would say the following. Government's behind the 8 ball at that point, because if you have people acting badly, whom you need to regulate, and they're trying to do so when all this distrust is in the water, then you have a fight. I say you're targeting me. You say you're trying to save my life.
Sure.
I'm not sure how that conversation goes well.
I will also take a point of New York City resident privilege. Obviously, the greater academic expert, but I actually live under Bill de Blasio's jurisdiction. And there have been a number of times when things have been said or done that really seem to reinforce that lack of trust. The infamous de Blasio tweets around the funeral last spring, or then when Cuomo did a press conference and put up a picture of Hasidim supposedly violating the regulations, and it was a funeral from 13 years ago. That's what he had put up a picture of, not any recent act of violating the COVID restrictions. And so it does, in an environment that is obviously a toxic stew of mistrust and stress and difficulty for so many other reasons, it only exacerbates the situation. There's a public health expert at the University of Chicago named Harold Pollack, who co-wrote an article in an opinion piece in the Washington Post recently about the need for the public health community, which is so concerned with cultural competence and being able to speak to people in minority cultures in their own idiom. And he said, and we neglected conservative religious communities. and to think about them as a group whose language we have to be able to speak and with whom we have to be able to communicate exactly around these questions, the values and the importance of religious services, what it does to a community to shut those down, the differential value being ascribed to religious services and social justice protests. And if we don't learn how to talk to them in their own language, that's just as counterproductive as not being able to speak to any other minority community in the language.
Yeah. And this is actually, it's a great segue for the last question that I want to ask you before we open it up and turn to people's Q&A, which is what Abby said before about progressive values versus conservative values lining up with the Orthodox community. What you're saying now about the ability from a progressive perspective to talk to different minorities, but not to know how to talk to conservative religious groups. I think the elephant in the room here in terms of progressivism and conservatism is Israel and its anti-Semitism, right? Meaning both of those are on the table. And I wonder, Rivka, if you could share from your experience as someone who is an educator in a modern Orthodox community, how large does Israel loom in people's decisions in this election? And what is the discourse at a deeper, more nuanced level, right? People want to paint it in very broad strokes. Paint it for us in more nuanced strokes, if you could.
I actually, I want to pause on Israel for 1 second and instead talk about how the Israel issue is refracted through the lens of American politics. Because there's a different conversation to have to talk about how people vote, who's going to give more money or funding or support. But as I'm watching the questions come in the chat, there are a few different questions that are essentially like, I don't understand how anybody could support Trump, Republicans, whatever it is. And I actually want to say again, in the spirit of understanding people, hearing them and hearing their concerns, it's not about agreeing. It's just knowing what people are concerned about. You don't have to agree with this, but there is a deep sense in the probably both on the political right, but also on the religious right, and those two things, as Abby has said, have come to overlap significantly in the Jewish community, that people on the progressive side of American politics either are implacably hostile to Israel or will be implacably hostile to Israel very soon. There is a strong sense that the demands of falling into line with progressive beliefs and values, understanding of what it means to stand for the underdog and for persecuted minorities and everything else, is that sooner or later you have to denounce Israel as the bad guy in any and all circumstances. Again, we don't have to debate about whether that's true or that's what progressivism really means. But there are more and more American Jews on the political and religious right who think that's what progressivism inevitably leads you to. And so it doesn't matter whose values I think are better for this, that, and the other. If I support a politician who lines up with that, inevitably I'm going to end up supporting a politician who is hostile to Israel and opposing Israel's interests in the world. And that significantly shapes how many American Orthodox Jews are going to be willing to engage in American politics. And right now you have a kind of a democratic apologetics going on in the United States, which is like, no, look at Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or Charles Schumer or Steny Hoyer, and they're also pro-Israel. And yes, and the median age of that group is 78 or whatever. I just made that number up, but it's way up there. And the younger Democratic politicians do not look or sound like that. And thinking about how that, so not Israel qua Israel, but the question of Israel as it plays out on the American political spectrum certainly significantly affects how, again, American Jews who see themselves as right-wing politically and right-wing religiously, and those things increasingly, obviously not entirely, but increasingly tend to overlap in American Jewish politics, how they relate to their voting, to the political spectrum in the United States, to the left liberal end of the political spectrum.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Just the creep of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment within the progressive side of the ledger, something that people are seeing and trying to see beyond the horizon, and that's a big concern in the Orthodox community. So Avi, we've got a question from the crowd here that I think relates to what Rivka is talking about, and that is the relationship between Orthodox Jews, or the alliances between Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians. And the question goes as follows. When Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians are lumped together, how do you feel they have a commonality? looking at the Jewish value of taking care of those who need help and treating people with respect. Not sure what the Christian right believes in other than the Messiah needs Israel to exist. Now, that's end quote. I did not make up that question. But the reason why, Avi, I think you're an interesting person to answer this question is because your understanding of the relationship between Jews and Christians is not only through the prism of Israel, it's through religious liberty. I think it would be great if you could say a few words as to what that alliance is about, not only in the context of Israel, and if you're not comfortable talking about Israel, you don't have to talk about evangelicals, Christians, and Israel, but I think it's important to understand relationships between Orthodox Jews and other religious groups as a starting point.
So I can certainly say in my part of the universe, there are obviously quite a lot of natural alliances when you think about questions of church-state relations. Certainly growing concern within the Orthodox Jewish community around questions of religious liberty in recent years. I think, there are events that happen, dotted events along kind of our recent history that have made Orthodox Jews more concerned about that, whether it's circumcision bans in San Francisco and 10 years back, or whether it's the feeling right now of being targeted for heightened regulation in the city of New York. And the reality is, the institutions that very frequently are the ones who are willing to help Jews out. And I mean that in a variety of ways. I don't just mean that in terms of filing suits to protect each other, to express legal positions that share share similar values, that attempt to provide space to these sorts of institutions to breathe and act and engage, but also just plain old resources. I mean, when I have an issue on if I have a particular personal religious liberty issue, something that came up recently out here in LA, I'm not going to say too much about it. I mean, the reality is the lawyers that came to help and broker negotiation between Jewish institutions and the state, they're Christians. They're the ones who put the Orah in and do a lot of the work. So there's a real natural alliance as a result.
I like your metaphor of the or. You clearly don't row, just the way it rolled off the tongue. They put the or in, I think, so there's natural alliances, yes.
Yeah. It's more natural. The alliance is more natural than the metaphor. So
exactly. But that is an important thing for people to understand, because people often see Jews and evangelicals on Israel as like the expression of it. But what you're saying is actually religious liberty conversations are often happening between Christians and Jews, and there's important reasons to ally with each other. Are there ways that you would want to see Jews and Christians differentiating themselves, even though they have to ally on certain things? Are there ways you would want to see them differentiating themselves? Are they too lumped together?
Yeah. So I would certainly say if on, there's one side of the ledger where we're trying to get space for what we think we have a right to do, what speaks to our equal dignity as American citizens, and the people who help you are the people you remember. That's just that's how these things work. On the flip side, we're religious minorities, so we don't quite have necessarily the same values around questions of religion in the public square. So much, if you ask anybody, people in the Orthodox community 30, 40 years ago went to public schools, the idea that we need more separation of church and state was, part and parcel of American ideology. And that's changed over time, as, government regulation has shifted, and there's quite a lot to say about that subject, but I would certainly say the following. I think Orthodox Jews still do remain somewhat concerned about certain kinds of issues that don't perfectly track their values. Abortion is probably a good example. We have this public conversation right now, given the confirmation hearings, about overturning Roe v. Wade. Abortion isn't quite a massive Orthodox issue, by which I mean the following. Orthodoxy, halacha, has complicated things to say about abortion. It's not like a yes-no kind of issue. When Ben Shapiro, a couple of years, maybe 2 years back, tweeted something about abortion, like Orthodox Jewish pundits went down on it.
The whole world went nuts. The whole Orthodox social media world said, no, let me tell you, I know.
Ben Shapiro said Orthodox halacha believes in it says abortion is prohibited, and you got so many tshuvot, discounting that view. It was from Twitter was on fire. You know, it's an interesting example because like this is all, you know, conservative Christians are talking about, and Jews are actually kind of quiet over here. And I think that's because like while we want to be, we're aligned in many ways with, you know, religious communities that share certain kinds of religious values, want to give priority to religious institutions, make sure that they have the things they need in order to operate, to live out lives of faith. At the same time, there are certain kinds of areas where we still want to, you know, mark off that halacha has a slightly different view than some of, you know, what the Christian right believes. And that becomes hard. And it becomes hard because on the one hand, people who help you when it's important, you want to help them. And on the other hand, you also want the opportunity to stake out your own territory when your own particular Jewish values say something slightly different. And balancing that relationship is hard. It's certainly very, very hard.
And I want to point out that that brings us back to what Rivka said earlier about the ways in which people curate their politics based on their religion, but you're talking about how people curate their religious message based on their politics. And really the whole project that we're doing with Jewish values and American democracy, that this has become de rigueur on the left and on the right, that you essentially, you side with your allies, which means you're going to give up a little bit of your nuance. So I want to bring up another kind of alliance or another kind of relationship with other groups in America, between Orthodoxy and other groups in America. And that is the relationship between American Orthodox Jews and people of color. Rivka, it would be great to hear your take. We know that there is a lot of foment and concern about the Black Lives Matter platform calling out Israel as a state that commits atrocities and genocidal acts, God forbid, not something that I think is true. And there's something going on here with the Israel conversation and the race conversation that I think you can give us a little bit of depth into. What do you see as defining relationships? I know that people are talking about the BLM platform, but what do you see as actually underlying the relationships between Black communities and Orthodox communities?
I think as we talk about Venn diagrams and circles and who's in what circle, I think it's important before we start this conversation to say that there's, of course, overlap in the circles of Orthodox Jews and communities of color, and there are Orthodox Jews of color who find themselves in particular and very challenging places in this conversation. So everything else—
Thank you for saying that. I should have. Thank you.
Everything else that I'm about to say about the relationship between Orthodox Jews and communities of color is not meant to ignore the existence of that group that lives in the overlap of those two circles, who have, you know, many more challenges of living with a foot in both of those worlds. Having said that, I think that this is a place where what I talked about earlier, which is the intense concern about what being on the left is going to mean about Israel, actually is a real block to empathy, understanding, hearing, listening. I think it's now widely accepted that by by metric of numbers of participants, that the marches and protests for Black lives from Memorial Day weekend and then, you know, into the summer was the largest set of protests in American history. Most of those people protesting had no idea that something called the Black Lives Matter movement put out a platform a few years ago that said that Israel A or B or C. They weren't marching about Israel. They didn't know about Israel. Israel was not on the agenda. They were marching because in the Black American experience, there are injustices that other Americans may have become aware of, you know, only recently or too late or only partially. And they're saying it is time for us to call attention to this and to get this fixed. And for us as Jews, or for us as Orthodox Jews, to never be able to hear somebody else's experience without putting ourselves back in the middle. It's like that old caricature, right? Is it good for the Jews? So tens of millions of Americans are marching against police brutality and police murdering an unarmed Black man. And I just want to talk about how this is going to make people think and feel about Israel. And that doesn't mean that Israel's not important. It doesn't mean is it good for the Jews isn't a valid question to ask at some point. But there also has to be a point in which we know the story right now is not about us. And to turn right around, and you saw this happening, you know, again in June, July, turn right around and turn the story into us and how do we feel about it and how we're reacting to it. how about if we take a deep breath and we listen? And we listen to Black Americans telling us their stories, and we listen to Black Americans talking about their experiences, and we listen to things that we don't know and they aren't part of our experience and they aren't part of our story. My encounters with the police don't look like that. My children's encounters with the police don't look like that. I don't anticipate that they ever will. And that gives me a perspective and a point of view on law enforcement and on America and on everything else that isn't the same as the one that many Black Americans are living with. And that means that sometimes I need to listen to them and hear what they are saying about their experiences. And as much as I might carry concerns or reservations about all kinds of things, about what it might mean for American Jews or for Israel, there is a time to just being open to hearing and listening to someone else's experience. And there were members of our community who certainly did that and who said, wow, I didn't know about this, think about this, hear about this. But I have to say there were plenty of members of our community who, you know, were quick to brush it off for these reasons. Again, I'm not denying the validity of those concerns, but to be unable to hear the experience of, you know, 10, 11% of the American population because of a platform that somebody ratified a few years ago is really a little bit to be missing the boat. To go back
to go back to our oars. So then it does sound like the next question would be, and by the way, one of the questions we got was, can you please extend this for 2 more hours? And I'm thinking my 6-year-old is literally sitting in the corner, so I don't think we're going to be doing that. But thank you for whoever asked that. But the next logical question is going to have to be, and we don't have time for it, how do you do that? Meaning you're saying, listen, even as people have their concerns, how do you hold both of those? You hold both of those rather naturally, but you're on the more progressive end of the spectrum in terms of your thought and social issues. So how does a person actually who's on the less progressive end of the spectrum hold both of those things together? Do you have an on one foot for that? Or is that a subject of a whole different conversation?
No, I do have an on one foot, and I'm going to be, do my profession. I'm a history teacher. That's what I do. And it has been my experience again and again. And I have brought this message not only to high school students. Teenagers are much more open and much more willing to listen than adults are. I brought this message not only to high school students, but I have taught this as a scholar in residence in Shul communities where I promise you, you would not think they were the most naturally receptive audience for this. And what helps is actually learning some Black American history. There's a lot of stuff of the history of Black people in America that many of us don't know. First of all, we weren't here. My grandparents, my ancestors were not here when some of this stuff happened. When the Colfax massacre happened in 1870, whatever, you know, we were in Jeshurun, actually, if you must know the name of the town, right? And while some of my grandparents were here when the Tulsa Race Massacre happened, others of my grandparents were not here when the Tulsa Race Massacre happened in 1920, right? We don't carry with us any kind of historical memory of these events. We just don't know what happened. And I find that when I tell my students these stories, they're like, that can't have happened in America, that can't be true. Because it's so horrifying that they can't believe that that's actually part of the American story. And when they hear that, and when they understand the African-American community is living with this as part of their history and part of their experience, they say, oh, and that doesn't mean they all walk away saying they've adopted the views of the political left, and oh, so now I support affirmative action, or oh, now whatever it is. But they understand someone else's experience in a different way and saying, what's the big deal? Just comply with the police and you'll be fine. Yeah, no, that's not it.
Yeah. So it's really giving ourselves an education without assuming that that has to change your political leanings per se, but seeing what happens when you have an education actually wash over you. And
I'm going to say one more
seeing
thing
what
here.
the results might be.
Probably obvious turn back into the conversation, but
Yeah.
I am committed to the religious community that I'm a part of, and I'm committed to staying in it. And that means that I'm committed to talking to a community, not all of whom share my politics. I am not doing that big sort because I'm choosing to stay. I work with it. I live and work in a community that's defined by its religious borders. And that means I have to figure out how to talk to people and how to engage with people and how to communicate with people who don't share my politics.
Beautiful. Avi, do you have a parting thought? Rivka, I'm going to count that as your parting thought, working with people who don't share my politics because we're in it together religiously. Avi, do you have a parting thought, something, an opportunity of the moment, or a message for people thinking about these issues?
Kind of hard to follow that one. I mean, that was.
It is kind of hard. If you just want to say check to that, you can say check to that. So Avi, would you like to say something?
I will say one thing, and I go back to something I said before, that I will say one of the things that really grates on me as I watch some other forms of this conversation unfolding, is what strikes me as the tarring and feathering of Orthodoxy on this kind of just out for what it needs. You see it out there in the media and things, and it strikes me as crazy that, in a democratic society, which was in many ways predicated at its very essence on the idea that each citizen would have the equal right and equal opportunity to express their view, to lobby, to cajole, to try to convince others of a particular form of policy. And then to see kind of how the votes came out, and ultimately to agree as a member of a democratic society that, that's what the majority said, and that's what we go with, even though it means I lay down what my interests are, because that's what we as a society decided, because we all have equal dignity and equal rights to make those decisions. I think the kind of the belittling of like a community advocating for itself as if it's self-interested and therefore dirty, I think is deeply problematic. I think there are principled ways to do it, and I think the Orthodox community, by and large, does a fine job pressing its case, as well it should. I want to hold that, though, on the same side as that doesn't mean that everything has to be, we advocate for our interests, but we have to do a far better job explaining how our interests come from a source of Jewish values. The reason why we want these things is because we think that society should value these things, and we have reasons for that. We have reasons that we want to invest in our institutions because of the values they represent. And, ultimately, maybe the antidote to kind of this, but it's all about you, is a little bit for Orthodoxy to dig a little bit deeper and talk about how its values animate its interests. I think there's an opportunity here to do that, because especially now with resources tight and people really jockeying because of how challenging the world is now, maybe kind of finding an opportunity to ground interests and values is the way forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will end by saying that I think that's what we were trying to do in this conversation, actually trying to break down some of the values and some of the concerns that are at play in the Orthodox communities that we know well. And one thing that I'm very grateful for is an opportunity to talk about the polarization within Orthodox communities as actually the existence of voices on both sides of the issue, as opposed to the way it's often portrayed, which is here's the percentage going this direction, and we kind of don't care about the loyal opposition. So the idea that there may be a majority going in one direction, there may be a loyal opposition going in the other direction, but there are values that people are balancing, and it's important for people to understand what those values are and make decisions accordingly. The last thing I want to say is we left congregation Beth Sholom off of our sponsor list, which is a terrible sin, because my in-laws, that's my in-laws' Shul. So congregation Beth Sholom, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Rivka. And this has just been I hope, a really illuminating conversation for people. Have a wonderful night.